Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Friday, April 16th, 8:30 a.m. Project Homekey info session. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague at the county, Carrie Sager.
Good morning, everybody. So we are here to talk about California's Project Homekey. Homekey is a state funding stream that allowed communities to purchase properties to be used as interim housing and eventually permanent housing for people experiencing homelessness. The first round of it launched last summer, and Marin successfully acquired 2 properties, one in Corte, Madera and one in San Rafael. Both of them are currently interim housing, but then are going to be converted into permanent units, which will result in 66 new units of permanent supportive housing in Marin. Now, the governor has requested a second round of funding, $750 million statewide for the program. And, we're anticipating that his request will be fulfilled by the legislature, so we are getting as prepared as possible right now. And that's the purpose of today's session. So in January 2019, we did a count of everybody experiencing homelessness in Marin and found over 1,000 people who were experiencing homelessness at that time. And Project Homekey, put simply, is a program that gives us a chance to attain the elusive ingredient to ending their homelessness, which is units of housing. Many of you have probably been seeing or even experiencing homelessness more since the start of the pandemic. The great majority of the people experiencing homelessness in Marin have been homeless in Marin for a long time. Some have disabilities and need a permanent home combined with supportive services to remain stably housed. And Project Homekey is a great way to make a major dent in this homelessness. So we're here this morning to have a discussion with you as a way of getting ready for this funding opportunity. Marin was one of the only counties in California to reduce chronic homelessness from 2017 to 2019. And over the past year, we've accelerated our success in finding houses for those experiencing homelessness by 46%. One of the main reasons for this is in 2015, our system in Marin had 193 units of permanent supportive housing, which is that supportive housing plus the supportive services. As of January 2020, we were up to 514 units, and we've added an additional 75 units through the use of federal mainstream vouchers in 2020. So as a result, today we're up to 589 permanent supportive housing units. So 193 to 589 in 6 years is basically tripling our housing stock. We did this through launching Whole Person Care, which provides intensive client-centered services, getting all of the homeless providers rowing in the same direction, and by having a super innovative housing authority. I cannot stress enough how amazing our housing authority has been to partner with us this way. And now I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Henning. So Andrew is with Opening Doors, which is a private-public partnership of funders and policymakers from across Marin, dedicated to ending chronic homelessness and veteran homelessness. And Andrew is the organization's project director. So over to you, Andrew.
Awesome. Thank you, Carrie. And again, good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen here. So I'm going to pull this up and make sure everything is optimized. We have a video to show you at one point. So again, we're doing these Project Homekey 2.0 info sessions. Carrie gave a great overview of what this is all about, and we'll be going into more detail in this presentation. Right here, we have our email addresses. So maybe Carrie, if you want to monitor the chat and maybe drop these in the chat. If anyone has any questions or comments or things that come up after the presentation, or there are things you want to say but don't want to say during the presentation, feel free to reach out directly to us at any time. A few quick housekeeping items. The first is that I mentioned earlier, I think maybe 1 or 2 other people joined, but this session is being recorded. All sessions are being recorded, and then they're going to be posted on YouTube. And I'll be sending actually, hopefully within about an hour and a half, 2 hours of this presentation, I'll be sending out links to all the recordings for people to watch. So just wanted to give everyone a heads up that it's being recorded. The format for today is that following the presentation, we'll be answering live Q&A through the chat of any questions that you have about Project Homekey. Carrie and I will be able to field, hopefully, any questions that come up. And then we're also going to have a link to a feedback survey, because the whole point of this is to really get your feedback, both on the criteria and the process, as well as possible projects for Homekey 2.0. I do want to say we're going to talk a little bit about homelessness overall in Marin County, but this presentation is primarily about Project Homekey 2.0. So I just wanted to caveat that we can talk a little bit about maybe homelessness generally, but it's really focused on this housing push. And then at this stage of the game, I think this is hopefully unlikely, but if we get Zoom bombed or some other kind of incident, we'll just end the session, and then I have everyone's email address and we can follow up and find another time to do this. Again, I think that's unlikely, but I just want to put that caveat out there. And then lastly, I would just direct you if you have any more questions. And again, we can try to field as many questions as we can, but marincounty.org/main/homekey. And even if you just Google Marin County Homekey, you should be able to find this link. The county's put together a really amazing FAQ about the program, both Homekey 1.0, and it's being updated for Homekey 2.0. So that's another really great resource. So agenda, so welcoming you right now and doing introductions. We're going to talk again briefly about homelessness in Marin overall. I'll give you a little bit of information about opening doors, just so you know what that is. And then the meat of this presentation is really about Homekey 1.0 and 2.0 and your questions. So I have a 45-minute version of this presentation, but I'm going to give you the 5-minute version. So again, if you have questions or thoughts, I'm happy to connect again offline. But as Carrie indicated, our systems change effort in Marin around homelessness really began about 5 years ago, almost exactly 5 years ago. And it started with a somewhat simple, but for at that time, not so obvious insight. And there's a lot of context to this, but in a nutshell, we came to realize that most of our challenges with the overall homeless community were really stemming from a small group of people experiencing long-term chronic homelessness. And when I talk about quote unquote challenges, an example of this would be if you were to think about everyone that was experiencing homelessness, from people that were temporarily homeless or even episodically homeless, which is actually most people who experience homelessness, versus people that are long-term chronically homeless, we find in Marin, and this has been found all across the country, that people experiencing chronic homelessness generate a lot of public service utilization. So whether it be EMS, jails, healthcare, behavioral health crisis services. Communities per capita are finding that they're spending roughly $60,000 per person for a person experiencing chronic homelessness. And the important thing to remember is that this really stems from a person's vulnerability. And so, morally, ethically, I think what drives a lot of our work is that these are some of the most vulnerable people in our community. These are folks that have disabling conditions such as behavioral health challenges, traumatic brain injuries, severe substance abuse disorders, chronic health issues, and often multiple of these challenges at the same time. And so studies have found that people experiencing chronic homelessness pass away on average 25 years earlier than their housed peers, not from an acute night of cold, but from many years of chronic health issues that go unaddressed. So this really for us is the core motivating drive, is to help these really vulnerable people re-enter housing. And so what we found back in 2016 was that while we had a lot of great programs and services in Marin, a lot of our focus was on this part of the curve. It wasn't focused on chronic homelessness. And so as we defined this as our problem space, we wanted to see what other communities were doing. So we hit the road. We went up to Sonoma County. We came down to Silicon Valley. We went to the East Bay, and we were learning how other communities were working to address this. And as you can see, Carrie was part of this back in the day. And we took our policymakers, our elected leaders to try to educate our folks on, what can we do differently? And at the same time that we were going on all these field trips, we also started mapping our local system of care and the actual lived experience of people that were chronically homeless. So this chart, basically being homeless is designated in the middle and housing is on the outside. And you can see that over the years, we created a somewhat convoluted web of different paths and services in order for people to get to housing, but it wasn't necessarily resulting in housing. And so what we found was that there was really this cycle at play, this kind of vicious cycle where we had people that were inherently challenging to serve because they had these underlying health issues, behavioral health issues, other challenges. We had created all these programs that were, again, well-intentioned, but had barriers or other obstacles that led to people failing out of those programs. The people themselves became more distrustful, understandably. They didn't seek help, and then those conditions got worse. And so when we were starting this effort, we were finding people who had been chronically homeless in Marin County for, in some cases, 30 and 40 years. And that's really what this was all about, is how do we help those folks? So the insight that we discovered from all of our field trips was that we don't necessarily need a behavioral health program or a treatment program. We needed a new process for recognizing the unique needs of every individual person that's living on the street. And so one of the programs that we ended up adopting was a program called the Homeless Outreach Team, which had been piloted and kind of pioneered in San Mateo County. And this has actually now been named a statewide best practice by the League of California Cities, thanks to our building on the model here in Marin. But the basic idea and the pilot at that time was focused in downtown San Rafael. And the idea was, let's get all of the service providers that might touch an individual together: city, county, Ritter Center, St. Vincent's, Homeward Bound, Buckaloo, and let's focus on a small number of the most visible, vulnerable people experiencing chronic homelessness. And then we're going to meet on a regular basis, and we're going to focus on how do we get those folks into housing. And basically, a way to think about this, and one of the programs we learned more about, was this idea of housing first, which is taking people directly from the street, wrapping them in intensive supportive services, and then putting them into a housing unit, versus the status quo, which is more of a management approach. And really, I think, is embodied by that map that I showed you. And so the research over the years has really proved that, housing first is, I think, in some cases 200, 300% more effective at keeping people long-term housed than the status quo of trying to manage homelessness. And that was what we found too. In the first 18 months of that program, we housed 23 of the most visible, vulnerable, chronically homeless people in San Rafael. And it really felt like we were onto something. So in 2017, in fact, October 1st of 2017, we launched what we call coordinated entry, which is a county-wide system for prioritizing housing placements that was based on this by name list kind of methodology that we were using with the homeless outreach team. And if you're curious about this, I would direct you to a movement that we've actually now joined. Marin County is part of this movement, called Built for Zero, which is now over 80 communities across the United States and Canada that are using this by name list approach to trying to end chronic and veteran homelessness by using data and best practices for trying to get people off the street. So we've joined this, and it's been hugely impactful for not only helping us to improve locally, but to see what's possible nationally as communities actually are demonstrably ending chronic and veteran homelessness. And so the impact here, so like I said, we launched coordinated entry on October 1st of 2017. Over those first 2 years, and Carrie said it perfectly, because of increase in our permanent supportive housing, we saw an almost 30% reduction in chronic homelessness in just a matter of 2 years. This was a period of time in which almost 80% of counties in California saw increases in homelessness. So this was really pretty substantial. Since 2017, we've now housed over 320 of the most vulnerable chronically homeless people county-wide, now that this is a county-wide strategy. And this one statistic's a little bit out of date. Our retention rate has dropped to 94%, but this is for everyone that we've housed since we started. So the retention in this program has really been phenomenal. And that's really, again, the goal and philosophy of Housing First. Speaking for San Rafael specifically, for people that were homeless previously in San Rafael and then afterwards, we've also seen major reductions in service utilization, whether it be criminal justice or EMS, which again was one of our hypotheses in the beginning. So the key question at this point is how have we done this? So believe it or not, most of our success, and really Carrie said this perfectly, has really been attributable to a partnership with the Marin Housing Authority. We've been able to leverage housing vouchers, Section 8 vouchers, in conjunction with the services Carrie described, to place people in housing units all across the county. We have people in rental units from Mill Valley to Novato, Larkspur, even as far west as Inverness. So this has really been an incredible opportunity to get people out into the community. And that really is the goal. Is, we've housed hundreds of people throughout the county, and most people would have no idea. And that's really the point, is that once people are back inside, they start living, a very, productive and thriving life again. Of course, the rental part has been a huge part of our success, but as Carrie said, we can't rely solely on rentals. And so we've also been focused on creating more actual affordable housing units. So, and some of the, this is a process, it takes time. So we're starting to see some of the seeds begin to flower of our efforts over the years. There was the Victory Village project in Fairfax, for example, that was for low-income seniors. And we were able to carve out some of those units for our folks that were chronically homeless seniors. And then as another example, right now in San Rafael, Homeward Bound is rebuilding the Mill Street shelter that they operated in San Rafael. And this is going to have 32 units of permanent supportive housing. So that's really where Opening Doors comes into the picture. So in the early days of our kind of systems change work and the HOT team in 2017, we began convening what we called at that time the Marin Chronic Homeless Action Task Force, or MCHAT, which I know is a horrible acronym, but basically the idea here was that as we were starting to learn more about housing first and this by name list methodology, we began to convene a group of stakeholders, county leaders, city leaders, philanthropy, faith-based, business, service providers. And we really spent almost 2 years educating ourselves about what other communities were doing, what our system was like locally, and then trying to figure out how do we really, and Carrie said this, the word that I love, accelerate, how do we accelerate our progress? And so what we realized as a group was the biggest value add that we could have was to create more housing. And the biggest barrier to creating more housing in our community is capital. And what I mean by that is local money that we have discretion over in order to pursue either creating, rehabbing, buying properties, and trying to create more housing. So in 2019, MCHAT rebranded itself as Opening Doors Marin. It became a 501c3 fiscally sponsored project under CVNL, the Center for Volunteer and Nonprofit Leadership. And in 2019, almost the entirety of that year was focused on exploring the feasibility of a public revenue measure in Marin County. A lot of other counties, both in the region and across the state, have passed, for example, housing bonds, which have allowed them to actually have that local capital to pursue projects. What we found in that messaging, and I don't think this is going to be a surprise to anyone, is that having local control is very important in Marin County. We want to have a say in the types of projects that we pursue. And so something like this would allow us to have that kind of local control over deciding which types of projects do we want to pursue where. And that was really the goal. Ultimately, however, through that kind of research phase that we were engaged in, we realized that there wasn't going to be enough political support in Marin County to pass a bond measure. So in 2020, we shifted to what we call our community business plan. And the idea here is using the data that we've been able to create over the years to really project out what is actually needed to end chronic and veteran homelessness in Marin County. And then our goal was going to be to focus on philanthropic giving, even regional philanthropy and development. And then, of course, COVID happened and the plan changed a bit, which I'll talk about in a sec. I did want to say, if you're curious about more about Opening Doors, you can go to openingdoorsmarin.org. But I would also encourage you to check out this organization, which is called Destination Home. It's a similar public-private kind of nonprofit based in Silicon Valley in Santa Clara County specifically. And they're probably about 10 years ahead of where we are. But they've done a phenomenal job of exactly like I talked about, raising that local money. They've helped pass a public revenue measure in Santa Clara County. The business environment down there is different, but they brought in tens of millions of dollars from the tech industry to support homelessness efforts. And they've also really tried to use data to inform what they're doing. So this is a really great model if you're interested in learning more. So Homekey 1.0. So in order to understand Homekey 1.0, we have to go to another confusingly named program, Project Roomkey, and talk a little bit about the initial state response to COVID. So last year in March, when the shelter in place started, the state basically, like I talked about earlier, recognizing all those underlying health vulnerabilities of the homeless community, said, we need to get people off the street and into a safer setting so there isn't a breakout of COVID among the homeless community. And so if you were to think of kind of typical congregate shelter, or basically, a large room with cots or bunks or whatever it might be, the goal of this was to create non-congregate shelter. So, and specifically to rent and lease hotel and motel rooms where people can move in and stay. Again, this idea was really about short-term interim housing. And frankly, it was a huge success. Across the state, communities, almost every county participated. And ultimately, over 22,000 people were able to enter this kind of rapid short-term housing to get off the street. And so because of the success of this, within a few short months, the state said, well, hey, what if there was a way to make this actual permanent housing? And so in June of last year, the state began to signal that it was going to reallocate some of its federal coronavirus relief funding and put it towards a permanent housing program. So they announced this in June, and then in mid-July, they came out with an actual notice of funding availability with applications due less than a month after that. And the idea with this funding was that it could be used for the acquisition or adaptive reuse of really any building, but specifically they were focused on hotels, motels, and commercial buildings. And there were a couple of caveats to this. One was that units had to be acquired by the end of the calendar year. This was in part because this was a reallocation of federal money, like I talked about. And so that money was basically use it or lose it. So that was part of the urgency to act. So units had to be acquired by the end of 2020. And then they also had to be operational at least 50% within 90 days of acquisition. And even though it was a very rapid and fast timeline, it had a pretty significant impact across the state. I think there were about 120 projects. It was either 90 or 120, something around 100 total projects, acquiring 6,000 units that have now helped over 9,000 people. And when you think about the fact that there are 150,000 people that are experiencing homelessness in California, this is really a gigantic impact. And so because of that, and I should say first that, as Carrie mentioned, we had 2 projects in Marin County that ended up being funded through Homekey. One was 3301 Kerner, which is located in San Rafael. It was a former commercial building. And then the other is what's being now called the Casa Buena, which was a motel in Corte, Madera, right next to Marin Joe's along 101. And so basically I was going to say, so because of the success of that, there's been this proposal for Homekey 2.0. But first I wanted to show you, and I wanted to acknowledge just right off the bat, that this process was faster than any of us ever would have really asked for or wanted. Most projects, such as even the Victory Village project or the Mill Street 2.0 project, those are multi-year projects that involve conceptual planning, community feedback, planning commission presentations and approval, city council presentations approval. That's the typical way that projects are created. And so when Homekey was announced and we had to rapidly scramble to find projects and apply, there was obviously a lot of concern from local communities about, is this really a good idea? And when we were going through this process, there was understandably a lot of, concern from community members about, is this actually a good idea? Should we pursue this? And so what I wanted to share with you is that actually Corte Madera has created a pretty, what I think is an innovative, maybe nation leading model for how to respond to this type of concern, and that they have created a community advisory committee that is helping to provide some guidance and oversight for the property. And Opening Doors Marin is actually helping to facilitate that group. And that group actually is having a community presentation on Monday night in Corte Madera about the work so far. But that group is working on things like communication, community communication, exterior redesign to the site, volunteerism, success metrics for the project. And one of the things that they put together was an actual virtual ribbon cutting. And so I wanted to play this video for you briefly because I think it really speaks to how, despite, understandable initial concern, these projects are actually a really positive asset for the community, and they're actually being embraced by the community as well. So I'm going to play this short video so you can hear from that community.
On behalf of Corte Madera's elected officials, staff, and residents, I'd like to welcome you to the Casa Buena, Corte Madera's first permanent supportive housing for those that experience homelessness. This was all brought together by a collaborative effort that included the County of Marin, Catholic Charities, Open Door Marin, town staff, and Corte Madera residents, who are also providing monetary and in-kind donations.
Marin has worked very hard over the past 3 years to address our homeless population. And with the Homekey project in Corte Madera at Casa Buena, we will be able to provide needed housing for 18 of our most vulnerable residents while wrapping all the services the county has to offer around them. I want to thank the community of Corte Madera, their city council, and the Casa Buena Steering Committee for working with the county to make this possible.
When I first heard of plans to build a homeless shelter in Corte Madera, I was very much opposed to it. It wasn't until I did a bunch of research on my own that I began to realize that permanent supportive housing can be an important solution to the homeless issue we have here in Marin County.
A safe home helps transform lives and creates essential stability, healing, independence, and dignity founded on hope. Our partnership with Marin County through Project Homekey and Homekey impacts many lives. Together, we strive to end homelessness in Marin.
From Corte Madera to Novato, Larkspur to Inverness, we have successfully housed hundreds of our community's most vulnerable chronically homeless people. Because of projects like this and the support of community members like you, I know we can reach our goal of being the first county in the Bay Area to end chronic homelessness.
One of the ideas we had was to create welcome baskets that could be given to each new resident when they move in. So we sent people shopping for everything from toothpaste to shampoo to snacks, cozy slippers, and grocery store gift cards. And the response from the community was frankly overwhelming. So many people wanted to be a part of this. It really embodies the spirit of Corte Madera as a welcoming place.
So on behalf of Corte Madera, I'd like to welcome our newest residents.
Welcome to Corte Madera!
So I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly love seeing Leela's kids at the end celebrate like that. And again, I just wanted to say, and I think Scott wouldn't mind me saying this, is that, you know, he was one of those community members that was very skeptical about this when he first heard about it. And because of the research that he's done, because of the programming that, you know, again, kudos to the county for really providing these intensive wraparound services for people in our permanent supportive housing, you know, people really see that this is a real positive for the community. So because of all this, as Carrie mentioned at the beginning, the governor has signaled at this point, I should say there is no Homekey 2.0 yet at this point. The governor's signaled that he would like to see a Homekey 2.0. He's proposed funding for a Homekey 2.0, but we're still waiting on the legislature to take action. As Carrie mentioned earlier, that could happen very soon. It could happen as early as next month. And given the urgency that we saw with Homekey 1.0 and the rapid turnaround, we could expect even a notice of funding availability for Homekey 2.0 as early as next month. And because of that, that's exactly why we're doing these community info sessions. Last time we did not have the chance to do this on the front end like we would have wanted to. We had to do some of it on the back end. And so this time around, we really want to get ahead of this. We really want to let the community know. We want to get community input on both the process, our local criteria, possible projects. And so that's really what this is all about. And I think at least at this point, even though we don't know exactly what the Homekey 2.0 legislation is going to look like, we're making assumptions about it based on Homekey 1.0. And so what do those assumptions tell us? Number one is that according to the Homekey legislation, the main applicant for these projects needs to be a government agency. So it could be a city, a county, a housing authority, even a tribal government. But it needs to be led by a government agency. That being said, they really encourage co-applicants. So that could be the county and a city. It could be a city and a nonprofit developer and a service provider. But really, you can have more applicants, but it really has to be led by a government entity. Like Homekey 1.0, we're expecting that it's also going to be for very flexible acquisition conversions. So that could be hotels, motels, commercial buildings. I know that in Southern Marin, there's been some advocacy around potentially even master leasing marina slips or other things like that. I know some communities acquired like trailers or other kind of tiny home type facilities. So it really is, our thinking is that it's going to be very flexible, just trying to make anything happen to get people into housing. Importantly, though, for these projects is we think that also, like last time, we're going to have to close escrow by the end of calendar year 2021. So these projects really have to be ready to go. And then also, like last time, we're expecting that they're going to have to be 50% occupied within 90 days of acquisition. So as an example, I think, this can't be a situation where you just have vacant land and you're planning to build a housing project there. That would not happen fast enough. And so it really is about this kind of creative, rapid acquisition rehab. And then the final piece, which I haven't touched on yet, is that there's also a local funding match requirement. This was the same as last time. And this is really important. And so I wanted to spend a minute to just break this down. So basically the way that the Homekey subsidy works is that it's on a per unit basis. So the per unit cost of a project. So let's say the cost of a project is $350,000 per unit. So the way this subsidy works is that for $0 to $100,000, the state fully subsidizes the unit, or fully subsidizes the cost. From $100,000 to $200,000, it becomes a 1-to-1 match, state to local. So the state covers 50, the local community covers 50. And then for 200 to 350,000, the state covers one. It's basically a 1-to-2. So the state covers 50,000, the local community covers 100,000, and that's the max for the state subsidy. So you could hypothetically apply for projects that are more than $350,000 per unit, but then it would become 100% on the community to fund that remaining gap above $350,000. So to put this in very concrete terms, if you were to imagine a 50-unit project costing $200,000 per unit, the state would contribute $150,000 per unit, or $7.5 million, and we would contribute $50,000, or $2.5 million total. If that cost per unit went up even $90,000, our local match requirement would increase to $110,000 per unit, or $5.5 million. And in the grand scheme of things, we're talking about millions of dollars. That might not seem like a lot, but as I said earlier, the whole genesis of Opening Doors Marin is that we do not have a lot of local capital for housing acquisition. So that's why it's very important for these projects that they're financially feasible and we keep the per unit acquisition cost as low as possible. Because even with these, frankly, huge state subsidies, which is incredible, we still need to be mindful of what we can contribute locally. And that then leads to the final part, which is really the draft local criteria that we're now using in trying to find projects in Marin County to apply for. So first and foremost is that we're looking for projects that are not in areas of concentrated poverty, such as the Canal and Marin City. Part of that, just to say up front, is really, I think ethically, we're trying to not crowd low-income housing projects into already low-income areas. We really want to make sure that we approach our housing like we've done with our rental units in an equitable way, and we make sure that people are being housed throughout the entire county in neighborhoods of every type. And so again, part of it is really just, I think, a principle. We don't want to keep doing that. Number two, though, is that there's a financial mechanism here as well. So a lot of the way that we fund affordable housing projects is that we take Section 8 vouchers or housing vouchers from the Housing Authority, and it's called project-based them to the unit. And so what happens is the units, rather than an individual getting the housing voucher, the unit gets the housing voucher. And I should say here that housing vouchers are not free housing. That doesn't mean all of a sudden you have free housing. It means that you pay 30% of your income towards housing, whatever your income might be. And then the subsidy, the voucher, covers the remaining balance up to market rate. And so that, because of that, that would allow for an operator of one of these sites to be able to essentially get market rates for the units, even though the units are subsidized for the individuals living there. And that's important because that operational funding is how we pay for operations. So like property management, property maintenance, security in some cases, and it's also how we pay for services. So if people are going to be successful in this housing, they need supportive services. And so that's why it's very important that we find projects that allow for having housing vouchers go with the units. So that's number one. Number two, and linked to number one, is again, we want to look for geographically distributed projects. So just like last time, we're not looking to do, I mean, I think it'd be very rare, but to do multiple projects in one community. We really want to have a portfolio of projects that represent the whole county. So that's important as well. And then this other piece too, this time around, we're really looking to try to include participation from nonprofit developers on the front end. And that happened last time, but this time we really want them to be involved. And part of that, again, is financial. So Homekey is really about the acquisition and rehab of properties, or sorry, it's about the acquisition of properties. It does not include subsidy for the rehab. And so in some of these cases, like buying a commercial building, there's substantial rehabilitation that needs to take place in order for that building to actually be lived in as permanent housing. And so what happens is we use the Homekey funding to acquire the site, and then nonprofit developers are able to use a funding stream called low-income tax credits to actually pay for the rehabilitation. And so that's why it's very important that we pursue projects that they would want to partner with. And for a lot of developers, in order to make it work financially for them, they're looking for a minimum size of about 45 units. I don't want to say that that's like a hard and fast, we can't do projects below 45 units, because every site has different financials. But that is something that we're leaning heavily on in this Homekey 2.0 process. Based on the financials that I shared a moment ago, we definitely want projects that are less than $350,000 per unit, and ideally less than $250,000 per unit for the reasons I described. And then lastly, we don't want projects that are just in the middle of nowhere. We want projects that are connected to grocery services or transit or healthcare services. This is actually criteria, or it was criteria in the Homekey 1.0 grant. And so this is something that the state's looking for too, is that we're making sure that these aren't projects in the middle of nowhere, that they're really integrated with the community so that people can be successful there. So next steps. So we're hosting 10 of these community info sessions. This is the 4th of 10. The county will also be later this month, or really any time now, releasing a request for interest for projects. So that'd be something that would go out to property owners that might be interested, and they could submit their interest in potentially selling or partnering to the county. We're having these community forums because we want to keep getting input on the criteria that we're using. And then as we get project recommendations, we're reviewing those projects, seeing if they're even for sale, what would they cost, could they be occupied on the right timeline, and then also vetting that with our local funders and developers. And then as that process is going, we're hoping to refine a list of possible projects to apply for. So with that, I'm gonna just cover it briefly, and then I'm gonna copy it into the chat. But we have a brief survey that you can fill out that just has a chance for you to provide information on the process, factors that will lead you to support a Homekey project, or factors that might lead you to opposing it. And then also, if you have actual project ideas, you could share those as well. So here's the link. I attempted to do a mini link, but it's still, I think, a little bit too long. So as I back out of this PowerPoint, Carrie, maybe if we have any questions in the chat, maybe if you want to MC that first, I will copy this link into the chat so that you can fill this out after the info session. And then I'll also be sending it in an email that you'll get later this morning that I mentioned. So with that, hopefully that was informative, and we'll move to the Q&A.
The only question we've gotten so far is about whether you can send out the PowerPoint.
Yes, I have the PowerPoint as a PDF file. And so I will be sending that out this morning with that email with all the recordings.
We've got a raised hand.
We've been doing, Craig, if you could actually type your question into the chat. We've just been doing questions through the chat, just because we're trying to record the log of questions as we build out an FAQ. So if you wouldn't mind maybe dropping your question into the chat, we can answer it there. Anything you think I missed, Carrie, or you want to add as maybe Craig's typing that, or?
Just let's see. No, I mean it's a pretty thorough presentation. So I'm not sure if there's anything else I would add. I do think this is the first presentation where I've joined Andrew as a county rep. And for my next one, I have to remember to like not pay attention during the video because those little kids at the end always get me really choked up.
It's really nice. It's honestly been really positive to see that community come together. And Leela actually, she was just a resident when she started on the committee, and she's now actually filled a vacancy on their city council. So she's actually now on the city council. So we have 2 council members on that committee, and she's been really wonderful. So yeah, it's been cool to see. And again, their hope is, I can't remember if I mentioned this, but they really want this to be a national model potentially. I mean, certainly locally, but I think having this kind of like community convening around these projects to really make sure that they're successful and embraced is their goal. Craig, I still see your hand up. I don't know if you're able to share your question in the chat.
The Q&A.
Oh, Q&A. Here we go.
Most of the homeless individuals at Lee Gerner Park are refusing sheltered housing. What do you do with the homeless that refuse shelter? I applaud all that you are doing.
Carrie, do you want to answer that, or I can take a stab at that? Or
sure, yeah. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, so I would say, actually, I think what's interesting, and I think it speaks a little bit to. I mean, first I want to say that our major shelter provider in Marin County, Homeward Bound, and then now Catholic Charities has been involved. They're actually running the interim shelter that's at the Casa Buena right now. You know, I think very highly of them. I think they do a wonderful job. I think what we've found over time is that there are some people that, for whatever reason, shelter just does not work for them. In some cases, it's just being around so many other people, and there might be underlying trauma in that person's life that makes that uncomfortable to be in shelter, whatever the factor might be. And if you actually go back to that kind of housing first visualization that we showed earlier, I think that kind of speaks to it too, that for a lot of people, really, honestly, the best intervention is to just get them straight to housing. We've actually moved a lot of our shelter system, and Carrie can speak to this in more detail. We've really tried to move from less of a first come, first serve basis shelter like we had in the past to more of shelter in Marin County is that stepping stone for people that are on track to get a housing placement. And so it's really meant to be a very, hopefully rapid throughput to housing. And so I think what we find is that people that might express not wanting to go into shelter or might decline services, a lot of it is probably, maybe when you really dig into it, some deeper kind of trauma or hesitance or skepticism about a past experience. And actually, when you offer permanent housing, we very rarely see people decline that. And if they decline it, honestly, it's probably behavioral health driven in nature, or there might be some other kind of issue at play.
Yeah, and I would just add, sometimes it's not even, I think that is, I 100% agree with Andrew, but also just sometimes it's even simpler than that. And it's just logistical. If you are in an encampment and you've got a tent and your tent's full of all your stuff, and if you're go into shelter, pretty much all of our shelters have limits on how much stuff you can bring in. So you're basically being asked to, you got a bicycle, you've got your tent, you've got your sleeping bag, and you can't bring it all into the shelter with you. So, there's a thought like, well, okay, even if I go into shelter, what happens when I leave shelter? If I'm not going from shelter into housing, then I'm not going to have my bike and I'm not going to have my tent. And, I'm just going to stay in my tent then, and then I don't have to worry about losing my stuff. So it can be as simple as that.
Exactly. And I think what's interesting is that, even as I mentioned, Homeward Bound is our biggest shelter provider. They're also, I think at this point, our largest local housing developer for permanent supportive housing. So they're totally bought in on more housing, and like the Mill Street project, that's really their goal. The other thing I would add, Craig, because I really appreciate your follow-up comment as well, is that through Opening Doors as an example, and I know there are lots of different programs and organizations looking at this, we have been really trying for almost, I guess, 2 years now, trying to figure out how to thread the needle of potentially working with faith-based organizations or other partners to create tiny home villages or housing options at faith-based sites. Because like you said, some people really like that environment and like that community environment. And there are programs throughout the country. I think Seattle's an example where they have a lot of tiny home villages on faith-based sites. I think they have 12 sites throughout the city ranging from, I think, 12 to 60 units. And so that is definitely something that I think could be really wonderful. And again, compared to kind of traditional development, tiny homes and that kind of project is much more inexpensive, at least on the development side. So that could be something, you know, our hope has been for a long time, if there's a faith-based organization in Marin County that wants to step forward and has land, you know, maybe we could use Homekey for acquiring tiny homes, or even outside of Homekey, we could pursue something like that. So I think that's what we found, is that it's really important to have a diversity of housing types. Some people like living with others in community. Some people do not and want to be on their own. Some people want a small space. So we really honor people's choice around that. So good question. Thank you.
And I do just want to emphasize that, you know, I think that Andrew really got to the heart of it is, you know, there are things for people who really like being in encampments. There are things that they like about the encampments that we can try and replicate in housing. But I think I just want to draw a distinction between that and sort of a sanctioned encampment model. I don't think anybody, even the folks in the encampments, would say that like this is the ideal living situation, right? Like they maybe they like the community, they like the independence. But I think most people would like to, for example, be able to go to the bathroom without going outside, right? Like, you know, porta potties are really not anybody's ideal situation. So, you know, if it's something like tiny houses, in living in sort of a more of a communal setting, you know, are there ways we can get to that? I think is definitely something to investigate. But I do think, you know, we're not totally ruling out any sort of sanctioned encampment. We're sort of looking into what that looks like in other communities. But, you know, at most, that is like a type of emergency shelter and not a type of housing.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I think we really just want to find that permanent housing opportunity and just end someone's homelessness for them once and for all. So, well, great. Well, I don't see any other questions, which hopefully is a good thing. But if you do have questions or other comments that you didn't feel comfortable sharing, feel free to email me. I see Carrie put our emails in the address. You can copy Carrie or email Carrie, whatever you're most comfortable with. And then, yes, Rachel, I will be sending that information out momentarily. So really appreciate the positive feedback. So that concludes today's session. So thank you again. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Take care.
Everybody.